dead don't get to hear what's said at their own funeral. I did. 3 days after the Coast Guard called off the search for Captain Robert Calloway, presumed drowned in a nor'easter that swallowed his ferry whole, a weathered man in a salt-crusted peacoat walked through his own front door and found his son Jacob alone at a lectern, rehearsing a eulogy that spent 4 sentences on Dad and 20 on the estate, the boat's resale value, and finally moving forward. The boy never even looked up. Captain Robert Calloway had spent 41 years navigating the deadliest stretch of water in New England without losing a single passenger. The town called him unsinkable, so when the storm took him, the grief was loud, public, and brief. What nobody knew was that the captain had survived, washed ashore on a remote island, and was making his way home to a son who had already stopped mourning and started measuring the furniture. To understand what I heard standing in that hallway, you have to understand who I was before the sea swallowed me. My name is Robert Calloway. For 41 years, I captained the Martha's Light, a 200-ton ferry that crossed Plum Gut 6 times a day. That stretch of water between Long Island and the New England coast has eaten 17 vessels since they started counting. I never added to that number, not once. The locals called me the Old Man of the Gut, and I earned that name in 30-foot swells and zero-visibility fog that would make a younger pilot weep. I had a wife, Martha, who passed 8 years ago from a cancer that took her fast and left me with a house too quiet and a son who had already drifted further than any current could carry him. Jacob was 34 when I went overboard. Bright, ambitious, sharp in the way that always reminded me of his mother, but with a distance in his eyes that had been growing since he graduated business school. He thought the ferry was a relic. He thought I was a relic. He'd been telling me for years to sell the boat, sell the house, move into something sensible. I told him the ferry was my life's work. He told me that was exactly the problem. The storm hit on a Tuesday in late November. The forecast said small craft advisory. By the time I realized they'd lied, the waves were 25 feet and the wind was screaming through the pilot house like a living thing. A rogue wave hit broadside. The Martha's Light rolled. I went over the rail before I could grab anything, and the last thing I remember is the cold hitting my chest like a fist and the sound of my own boat's engine fadding into the storm. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days, 2,800 square miles of ocean. They found my cap floating near Fisher's Island. They found a piece of the rail I'd been standing beside. They did not find me. On day 4 they called it, presumed drowned. The mayor lowered the flag to half-mast. The local paper ran my photo on the front page under the headline, "The Unsinkable Captain Finally Meets His Sea." Jacob posted a tribute on social media. I was told later it was tasteful, short, and already certain wheels were turning. What nobody knew, what the Coast Guard could not have possibly guessed, was that I had washed ashore on a tiny island 12 miles southeast of the search grid. A place called Gull Rock, uninhabited except for one man, an old lighthouse keeper named Oliver Trask, who had been tending a decommissioned light for 30 years out of sheer stubbornness. He found me on the rocks at dawn, half-drowned, bleeding from a gash in my scalp, but breathing. He dragged me up to his cottage, stitched my head with fishing line, and wrapped me in wool blankets that smelled like mothballs and kerosene. There was no phone, no radio that could reach the mainland. The supply boat came every 10 days. I had missed it by 4 hours, so I waited. For 8 days I sat in that cottage, staring at the sea that had tried to kill me, and thought about my son, thought about the funeral he must be planning, thought about the grief he must be carrying. I told myself that when I walked back into that house, I would hold him and apologize for every argument, every cold silence, every year I'd spent more married to that boat than to the memory of his mother. I was a fool, I know that now. On the 9th day, a lobsterman named Danny Phelps spotted Oliver's signal fire and came to investigate. He almost fell out of his boat when he saw me standing on the dock. By noon, I was back on the mainland. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want a scene. I wanted to surprise my son, to give him the miracle he deserved. I took a taxi to my own house, a saltbox colonial on a quiet street in New London, lights still on inside, and I stopped at the front door because I could hear a voice. Jacob's voice, clear, composed, rehearsing. My father, Robert Calloway, was a man who loved the sea. That was the opening line. But it was the next sentence that stopped my hand on the doorknob, and the sentence after that. And the one after that. I stood in my own hallway, still in the same salt-stained coat I'd been wearing when the wave hit, and listened to my son practice a speech that was never meant to be heard by the living. His voice was steady, unhurried, the cadence of a man delivering a quarterly earnings report, not a farewell to his father. Robert Calloway was a man who loved the sea, he said again, then paused, and I heard the shuffle of paper. Is that too generic? Let me try. My father dedicated his life to this community, ferrying thousands safely across waters that claimed lesser men. That's better. Okay. Transition to legacy. The estate is straightforward. The primary residence at 14 Harbour Street has been appraised at $470,000. The Martha's Light, fully restored, has a current market value between $300,000 and $400,000, depending on buyer interest. I've already contacted a broker in Mystic who specializes in heritage vessels. I didn't move. My hand was still on the doorknob, frozen there, and something inside my chest that had been warm and hopeful since Oliver Trask pulled me from the rocks turned cold and still. He was rehearsing the financial liquidation of my life like he was reading from a prospectus, and he hadn't even waited for the body to wash up. The life insurance policy, Jacob continued, flipping a page, is in review. There's a standard 2-year contestability window for presumed death without a body, but I've spoken with an attorney who believes we can accelerate based on the Coast Guard's official report and the recovered personal effects. That should net another $500,000 minus legal fees. Mom's old jewelry has been appraised separately. The coin collection I'll handle through an estate auction house in Boston. I counted the sentences he had spoken. 4 were about me, 4 sentences. 23 were about money, property, assets, and the logistics of dismantling everything I'd built, and every single one of them was delivered with the same flat, businesslike tone he used when explaining quarterly margins at his firm. There was no crack in his voice, no hesitation, no moment where he set the papers down and had to collect himself. My son was not grieving. My son was closing a deal. But here's the thing about standing perfectly still in a hallway while your world rearranges itself into something unrecognizable. You hear more than words. You hear pauses. You hear the absence of things. I heard the absence of my wife's name beyond the jewelry appraisal. I heard the absence of any mention of the scholarship fund I'd quietly started for the children of lost fishermen because Jacob didn't know about it. I'd never told him. I'd never told him a lot of things, it turned out, because we'd stopped talking about anything that mattered a decade ago, and what I was hearing now wasn't just greed. It was the logical conclusion of that silence. 2 strangers sharing a last name, one of them presumed dead, the other already measuring the curtains. He kept going. I've contacted a real estate agent regarding the Harbour Street property, should list by next week. The sooner we get it on the market, the less carrying costs eat into the estate. I've also reached out to the marina about transferring the slip license, and there's a buyer interested in the truck. It's a 2003 Ford, not worth much, but every bit helps. The truck. He was selling my truck. The bench seat where I'd taught him to drive stick when he was 15, grinding gears in a church parking lot while his mother pretended not to be terrified from the passenger side. I wondered if he even remembered that. I wondered if the memory had been assessed, priced, and liquidated along with everything else. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a naive man. I've spent 41 years watching people at their worst. I've pulled bodies from the water. I've delivered news to families that made them collapse on the dock like their bones had turned to sand. I know that grief wears different masks, that some people process loss through logistics, through control, through the cold comfort of checklists and spreadsheets. I was prepared for that. What I was not prepared for was the moment Jacob set down his papers, pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me," he said after a moment. "No, still no updates on the remains. Coast Guard said it's unlikely they'll find anything. The currents in the gut are brutal." He listened for a moment. "No, I'm fine. Honestly, I'm fine. I know that sounds cold, but you and I both know it's been complicated for years." Pause. "Right, exactly, so the timing actually works out. When the policy clears, I'll have the liquidity I need to move on the Connecticut expansion. I talked to the bank on Tuesday. They just needed proof of death or presumption. The Coast Guard report satisfies that." I closed my eyes. The Connecticut expansion. I knew what that was because Jacob had pitched it to me 6 months earlier at a dinner where he barely touched his food. He wanted to open a second location for his financial consulting firm, a move that required capital he didn't have. I had told him no. I told him to build his business slowly, the way I built mine, with patience and sweat and a refusal to take shortcuts. He had nodded, said he understood, and then I watched the light go out behind his eyes the way it always did when he didn't get what he wanted. I'd assumed it was disappointment. I had not understood that it was calculation. The person on the other end of the phone said something that made Jacob laugh, a short, dry laugh without any warmth in it. "No, I'm not sad," he said. "I mean, I thought I would be, but honestly, it's a relief. You know how he was. Every conversation was a lecture. Every decision was a referendum on my character. The man could turn choosing a dinner restaurant into a lesson about delayed gratification." Another pause. "Yeah, exactly. And the boat. God, the boat. You know, he loved that rusted tub more than he ever loved me or Mom. He'd spend 16 hours on the water and come home and have nothing left for us. Mom used to say the Martha's Light was his real wife. She was joking, but she wasn't wrong." I opened my eyes. The hallway was still there. The coat was still damp. I was still alive. And my son, my only child, the boy I had carried on my shoulders through every parade this town ever held, was telling a stranger on the phone that I had loved a boat more than I loved him, and that my death was a relief. Not a tragedy, a relief. Because now he could finally get what he wanted without me standing in his way. I thought about Oliver Trask. I thought about the 8 days I'd spent in that lighthouse, staring at the grey Atlantic, promising myself that I would be a better father if I ever got the chance. I thought about the apology I'd rehearsed, the words I'd shaped and reshaped in the dark, the specific ways I planned to tell Jacob that I was sorry for every missed baseball game, every cancelled dinner, every time I'd chosen the ferry over family because the ferry made sense and family was complicated. I had a speech of my own. I'd practiced it more times than he practiced his. And now I was standing here, hand on the doorknob of my own house, listening to the only person I'd wanted to come home to explain why my absence was an opportunity, not a loss. Jacob continued on the phone, his voice dropping into something more confidential, more honest, as if the rehearsal was over and he was now speaking freely. "The funny thing is, I thought I'd feel guilty about the timing, about not feeling worse, but I don't. I really don't. He made his choices. He chose the water. He chose the boat. He chose to be the town hero instead of being a father. And now I'm choosing me. The estate's worth about 1.2 all in. That's my number. That's what I need. The rest is just paperwork. I don't remember making the decision. I don't remember my hand turning the doorknob or my feet crossing the threshold. I don't remember pushing the door open. But I do remember Jacob's face when he looked up. The color draining out of it so fast it was like watching water run from a broken hull. The phone dropping from his hand and clattering on the floor. And the only word he could manage, barely a whisper, the word that hung in the air between us like the last echo of a ship's bell before the storm finally swallows it. "Dad." For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood in the doorway, still dripping from the rain, still wearing the same coat that had salt from the Atlantic in its seams, and I looked at my son. Not the way a father looks at his child, the way a captain looks at a reef that just appeared on the sonar. The papers were scattered on the lectern. The phone lay on the floor, still connected to whoever Jacob had been confessing his relief to. I could hear a tiny voice saying his name, tinny and confused. I walked across the room, bent down and picked up the phone. I pressed the end call button without saying a word. Then I straightened up, handed the phone back to Jacob and said, "You dropped this." He took it. His hand was shaking. His mouth opened and closed, trying to find the words you say to a dead man who just heard your private eulogy. I didn't give him any. I walked past him to the lectern, picked up the speech he'd been rehearsing and read it. All 4 sentences about me. All 20-something sentences about the estate, the boat's resale value, the smooth transition of assets. I read it front to back, folded it neatly, and put it in my coat pocket. "We'll talk in the morning," I said. "I need a shower and a meal that isn't canned beans from a lighthouse keeper's pantry. You need to figure out how to explain that phone call to yourself." I walked upstairs. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I didn't cry, though I wanted to. I just stood in the shower and let the hot water run over the scar on my scalp where Oliver had stitched me with fishing line, and I thought about something my wife once told me in the last weeks of her life. She said, "Rob, we gave that boy everything, but we never taught him how to lose." She was right. We never did. And now the first real loss of his life was supposed to be me, and he'd already turned it into a profit center. The next morning, before Jacob woke up, I went through his office. I'm not proud of that. I'm not ashamed of it either. I found a folder labeled Estate Pending. Inside were documents that went far beyond what I'd heard him rehearsing. The house on Harbor Street was already listed with an agent. The listing agreement was dated 3 days before the Coast Guard called off the search. 3 days. They hadn't even finished looking for my body, and my son was already marketing my home. There was an email chain with a boat broker in Mystic. Subject, Martha's light accelerated sale. Jacob had provided photos, maintenance records, and a proposed asking price of $375,000. The broker had replied, "Sorry to hear about your father. We'll get this handled quickly for you." Jacob hadn't corrected him, hadn't said thank you or he was a good man. Just, "Can we close by end of month?" There was also correspondence with an attorney, separate from the one handling the life insurance. This one was about contesting the policy's timeline, requesting an expedited declaration of death, and exploring whether a missing persons declaration from a court could trigger payout before the standard waiting period. Jacob had been doing legal homework. For months, maybe. I couldn't be sure because some of these emails were dated before the accident. I found a draft letter to the life insurance company, dated 3 weeks prior, that began, "In the event of my father's incapacitation or disappearance, I request immediate review of policy number." I sat in his desk chair in his house. It was my house, actually. He'd moved back in temporarily, he said, to help manage things in my old age, and I read through 6 months of quiet, patient planning. My son hadn't been waiting for his inheritance. He'd been engineering it. And the storm that took me overboard, that was just dumb luck. A dark, ocean-sized gift that dropped right into his lap. But here's the thing I couldn't figure out. Did he hope I was dead, or did he just not care either way? The eulogy was for a father he'd already buried in his heart years ago. The paperwork was for a financial transaction that happened to involve a corpse. The relief in his voice was the sound of a man who had finally stopped pretending. And that was the part that kept me up at night, long after Jacob had moved to a hotel, claiming he needed space, but really because he couldn't stand the sight of his own conscience sitting across the breakfast table. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do best, navigating. I didn't rage. I didn't confront him again. I went through every account, every deed, every insurance policy, every investment. I hired a forensic accountant, a man named Gerald Prout, who had once traced a fraud that spanned 4 continents. I told him, "I need to know what my son has already spent, already promised, or already positioned to take." He nodded and got to work. What Gerald found made the eulogy sound like a greeting card. Jacob had not only listed the house and the boat, he'd transferred a small joint account into his own name, claiming it was for estate management. He'd contacted a real estate developer about subdividing the waterfront property that had been in Martha's family for 6 generations. He'd taken out a personal loan, using my retirement account statements as collateral, on the assumption that the funds would soon be his. The loan was approved. The bank had already wired him $50,000. I read all of this in my living room, on a Tuesday afternoon, with a cup of coffee that went cold before I could finish it. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Helen Shaw who had been with my family since before Jacob was born. I said, "Helen, I'm going to rewrite my will, everything, and I need you to help me set up a foundation." She asked what kind. I told her it would be called the Martha's Light Foundation. It would fund volunteer maritime rescue crews, the kind that had been losing funding for years, the kind of men and women who go out in the worst weather to pull strangers from the sea, the kind who saved my life when no one was looking. I would pour everything into it, the house, the boat, the investments, all of it. Jacob would get a bequest, yes. A modest one, conditional on him completing a year of service with a rescue crew himself. If he refused, it would go to the foundation too. And if he contested it, Helen Shaw would be waiting with the emails, the loan documents, and the letter to the insurance company that predated the storm. But before I could sign a single piece of paper, I had to do the one thing I'd been avoiding for weeks. I had to sit down with my son and tell him exactly what I'd found and exactly what I was going to do about it. That conversation would change both of us forever. And it started with a single question that I had never once, in 41 years of ferrying passengers through hell and high water, been afraid to ask anyone. Until now. "Son, when did you stop waiting for me to come home?" We were sitting in the same living room where I'd taught him to tie a double half hitch, where his mother's piano still stood, untouched since the day she died. Jacob looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him without the filter of a father's hope. He didn't answer the question at first. He stared at the coffee table between us, at the folder I had placed there, the folder labeled Estate Pending, and I watched him calculate. Even then, in that moment, he was running the numbers. "I don't know," he said finally. His voice was thin. "I don't know when it stopped." I told him what I had found, not with anger, with the same steady voice I'd used for 41 years to radio the Coast Guard when things got rough. I walked him through the listing agreement, the broker emails, The insurance letter dated 3 weeks before the storm. I showed him the personal loan documents, the $50,000 already wired, the subdivision proposal for his mother's family land. I didn't ask him to explain because any explanation he could offer was already a confession. You were never supposed to see any of it, he said. That was his defense. Not I'm sorry, not I made a mistake. I wasn't supposed to see it. The dead aren't supposed to walk through the door. I told him I was rewriting the will. I told him about the Martha's Light Foundation, about the maritime rescue crews who had lost their funding, about the men and women who would now receive everything I had spent a lifetime building. I told him he would receive a bequest, enough to start over if he chose to, but only if he completed 1 year of service aboard a volunteer rescue boat, the same work that saved my life. If he refused, the bequest would go to the foundation, and if he contested it, Helen Shaw would present the emails, the loans, and the insurance letter to a judge. Jacob laughed, not the dry, relieved laugh I'd heard him give on the phone that night. This was different. This was a laugh with no air in it. You'd really do that, he said. You'd give everything to strangers just to punish me. No, I said. I'm giving everything to strangers because they're the ones who still believe in pulling people from the water. I'm giving you a choice because you're still my son. Punishment would be taking the choice away. He walked out that night. I didn't stop him. In the weeks that followed, Helen Shaw drafted the foundation documents, the new will, the conditional bequest. I sold the Martha's Light myself, not to the broker Jacob had contacted, but to a non-profit that runs educational programs for at-risk youth. The house on Harbour Street went on the market, and the proceeds went directly into the foundation's endowment. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment near the docks, close enough to smell the salt, far enough from the memories to sleep. Jacob did contest the will. I expected him to. Helen was ready. The court case lasted 4 months. When it was over, the judge ruled in my favor, citing the clear evidence of Jacob's pre-accident financial maneuvering. The conditional bequest was voided by his refusal to serve. He received nothing, not a single dollar, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt the hollow weight of a story that had ended exactly the way I had always feared it would. I spent my remaining years doing the work I was born to do, not ferrying passengers, but crewing a volunteer rescue boat out of Stonington. The absolution, they called her. I was 73 years old, still pulling strangers from the sea, still chasing the same purpose that had pulled me back from Gull Rock. People asked me why I didn't retire. I told them I had tried it once. It didn't take. And here is the thing I didn't see coming. The final twist in a sea that I thought had shown me every trick it had. 3 years after the court case, after Jacob had disappeared from my life entirely, I got a letter. Postmarked from a small town in Maine, a fishing village so remote it barely appeared on maps. Inside was a photograph, a crew of 6 on the deck of a rescue boat, smiling, covered in salt, and in the back row, older, thinner, wearing a life vest with the words "Volunteer" stenciled on the chest, was Jacob. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting I recognized, were 4 words: Year 1, Day 1. I never replied to that photograph. Some things don't need a reply. The picture said what 3 years of silence had failed to say, that a father's refusal to be a transaction had forced his son to become something real. Not right away, not easily, but eventually. The boy who had practiced my eulogy like a quarterly report had finally found his way to a boat that asked nothing of him except to show up, to pull a stranger from the cold, to earn his place in a crew that doesn't care whose son you are. Year 1, Day 1. The bequest never mattered. The inheritance never mattered. What mattered was that he chose to start, not because I demanded it, not because a court ordered it, but because somewhere in that hollow year after I rewrote his future, he understood that the only thing I ever wanted from him was for him to learn how to stop measuring what he could take and start noticing what he could give. The sea saved my life twice, once from the storm and once from my own son. If you've been listening and this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And if you've ever looked at someone across a table and wondered who they really are, maybe ask them before the eulogy gets written.